Good. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm Martin Reynolds. Rather like Gary, I'm very happy to say I'm a retiree from the Open University. So I actually belonged to the Applied Systems Thinking group at the OU for many years. And what I'm be talking about today is this idea of literacy. And of course, diagramming is a very powerful form of systems literacy. It's not the only form. There are different types of narratives that we use: storytelling, images, metaphors. There's a whole raft of different literacy types that we can draw on to practice our systems thinking literacy. So the backdrop of this is 16 years now we've had of postgraduate systems thinking in practice teaching at the Open University, exclusive teaching around postgraduate systems thinking, which builds on the prior undergraduate programs that we had that Ray talked about earlier. As part of that systems thinking in practice program that I've been involved with, again with colleagues including Kevin, Rupesh, Magnus and others, and Ray of course, we developed some research, some action research with our alumni, which, and this is sort of action research that started in 2013-14, and it's around some projects which was funded by the university, STEAM projects, which were trying to track the difficulties or the experiences that our systems thinking alumni, our STIP alumni, carried with them after leaving the Open University. The Open University provides quite a nice safe space, essentially, for them to practice these systems thinking ideas in their workplace with the support of associate lecturers. But once they leave the Open University, once they leave that safe space, but yet they're still in their employment area, usually their employment area, they don't have that support necessarily. And so the big feedback that was coming from those action research projects from our alumni was this lack of recognition of systems thinking in practice, as I'm sure a lot of people here would experience anyway, which started us in the process of working with SIO and other partners in developing the Systems Thinking Practitioner apprenticeship and the standard. As a result of that, we eventually got permission to develop our own, and that was approved in 2020, the actual standard. So it was a great achievement, I think, by many of us involved with that. We then started to develop at the Open University our own program, which included these two modules. One module was the evidencing systems thinking in practice. It's a portfolio module, and that's experience. That's the module that Ray and I have been working on, which is the backdrop really of this concern around systems thinking literacy. And it really sort of flushed out the issues of what is it that is the real task of developing systems thinking in practice capabilities. And we developed this module where the capabilities depend on the systemic sensibilities that we have, that we all basically have. It was talked about in earlier discussions this morning. And of course, Kevin has been talking about how we kind of lose that ability to represent those systemic sensibilities through the act of drawing, for example. The other module, which I just wanted to mention here, is the one developed by Rupesh Shah, Magnus Ramage, around co-designing interventions with STEP. And what I'll be doing, one of the things that I'm carrying on with is responding to a commissioned book, edited book on key theories of a guide to key theories for systems thinking, which I'll be working with Huda and Rupesh and another colleague from South Africa on. So that's a general backdrop. What I want to talk about today is this idea of having a requisite systems thinking literacy, and particularly the kind of tensions that there are around developing a systems thinking literacy, whether that literacy is in the form of diagramming or written forms of literacy. It's the way in which we converse with others as an interdisciplinary and a transdisciplinary endeavour, which is what systems thinking in practice really just holds on to. That's what it is. It's a transdisciplinary endeavour. And these are the three kind of issues that I'd like to talk about, and that I think are absolutely key for us to get our heads around in order to enable that conversation to be more meaningful. One of the key problems, it seems to me, around developing systems thinking in practice is this gulf between our enthusiasms for systems thinking that we bring to a particular situation, that bring to a professional domain, and the lack of reciprocity, if you like, around that enthusiasm. So we often talk past each other. And how do we try to resolve that? And that's the key thing that I'd like to be talking about. So after talking a bit more about each one of these different items, capabilities, reasoning and robustness, I'll then present this activity model that Ray and I have been involved with developing in the as part of that evidencing STEP module. So these are the tensions and traps around these three areas. Capabilities, first of all. I think the major problem around capabilities is this fixation that we may have about the enchantment of measurable outcomes. These extrinsically ascribed attributes, which are manifest in terms of competency frameworks, for example. They're manifest in terms of the KSBs of the standard, of the Systems Thinking Practitioner standard. There are 57 of those KSBs, knowledge, skills and behaviours. So how do we deal with that, with those measurable outcomes, which you think are actually quite important? They're systematic, but they're important. But taking into account these kind of less measurable, experiential, intrinsically driven aptitudes. And how do we try to avoid the risk of being unprofessional in that process? Secondly, around the reasoning, there is this concern, I think, personally speaking, around a kind of what I would call a methodical fetishism, commodity fetishism sort of idea. We get too fixed on our models, on our methodologies, and we promote those and say those are the answers to our systems thinking in practice endeavours. And it's manifesting in our teaching of the rules, the constitutive rules of different systems approaches. You know, you move away from those rules at any time, then you're not really a good systems thinking practitioner. Whereas actually, we should be providing a bit more space for getting outside those rules. And again, in the tradition of good systems thinking in practice, it's that experimental idea of using these different ideas, concepts, metaphors, whatever, from different lineages that belong to the professionals that we're talking with, that we're conversing with. So it's trying to privilege a bit more of these kind of what I would call abductive storylines of reasoning. But again, avoiding the risk of the claims of relativism. And robustness, again, with systems thinking practice, there's a kind of a drive towards having a scientifically robust discipline now, because we are a profession. There should be very firm robustness, which depends on the reliability, essentially, of the practice that we do. And what I would suggest is that perhaps that concern about reliability is at the expense of including other, what I would call co-guarantor attributes of resonance and relevance into the mix. So starting with capabilities, this is a kind of a definition of capabilities that we've used in the glossary of our systems thinking in practice. So what are they? In distinction from competencies, they're personal aptitudes. They enhance an individual's intrinsic ability to make appropriate choices. It's an ongoing practice of purposeful practitioner, of having that freedom to choose. Again, drawing on Amartya Sen's notion of a capabilities approach, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And they're different from these kind of predetermined purposive systems of actions. Expressions of capability may involve emancipation from others, from their extrinsic definitions of competence. So there really is a kind of a tension between capabilities and competence. There's a competence that we may have. Again, it speaks to the notion of drawing. We lose that sort of sense of competence maybe in drawing. And I think we get too exercised by the notion of these extrinsically determined ideas of competence at the expense of that kind of playfulness around capabilities. They're much less easy to frame by definition. They're very difficult to actually measure. So those are the kind of issues that we're dealing with there. Capabilities matter in the sense that this is a lovely sort of definition of a system. We've seen lots of different definitions of systems thinking. This one came up fairly recently with me. And it comes from a group of educationalists. I think they're Scandinavian educationalists. And the definition was around education, using systems thinking in education. It's the ability to reason about phenomena in terms of systems characteristics, systems literacy, etc., to create a coherent understanding of that phenomena, whether it's educational phenomena or whatever phenomena that we're dealing with. But it's that reasoning which I think is the key thing here. And Amartya Sen's notion of a capabilities approach is that its development should enhance people's ability to lead the lives they value and have reason to value. So it's that reasoning process that we're engaged with that I think is really important in developing an appropriate requisite systems literacy. Just to go back to that slide, I mean, one of the things that they do with this, with the characteristics, they list down a number of different characteristics of what systems thinking is about. So boundaries, components, interactions, input to output, etc., feedback. And you can go on, you can list these different terms and say, yes, that's systems thinking. But just by listing those as sort of descriptors can be a bit flaky, and we need to be cautious about that. So with reasoning, we need to have some sort of notion of what the theoretical lineages are that inform our systems thinking in practice. And again, there's many different ways of trying to explore, diagram the different types of reasoning lineages. And depending again on the perspective that we have, and of course there's lots of multiple different lineages that are apparent there, and they can all form, in some essence, the basis of a systems literacy. But you can't just include everything in order to have that conversation with the people that we're dealing with. Those theoretical lineages is a mental model, if you like, that I've devised around the development of those lineages. I've listed particular types of lineages, and let's face it, the theoretical lineages are conceptual constructs. They are systems. And I think, again, we lose sight of that at times, and it's well to remember that those theoretical lineages, as conceptual constructs, bounded ideas, can be used purposefully for our actual engagement with the practitioners that we're dealing with engaging with our interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary endeavours. And that's what I mean by having a requisite literacy. We need to somehow have to select out particular aspects of our theoretical lineages and other kind of expressions of reasoning that match the professional or the situations that we're working with. Whether the profession is a group of engineers, whether it's policy advisors in a particular field, whatever. But somehow they have to match up with that. And my suggestion around this is that we have to, first of all, get some basic form of literacy that will speak to all different types of practitioners that we're working with. So it's the communication that is the important thing here, the interaction. In our Systems Thinking in Practice program, with the core, one of the core modules, I developed these threshold concepts: understanding interrelationships, engaging with multiple perspectives, and reflecting on boundary judgments. Those threshold concepts are based on the idea of boundary critique, which some of you may be familiar with, which comes from Werner Ulrich, and which in itself comes from a tradition of American pragmatism of C. West Churchman in particular, as well as John Dewey, William James, and Charles Peirce. So it's a rich foundation actually around the development of those threshold concepts. Right. 5 minutes. Well, this is going on to the robustness element. So with robustness, what I'm suggesting here is that we have some kind of interaction between these three different elements. And the robustness is an interaction between three different co-guarantors of rigour. Again, reliability around the factual judgments, resonance as far as the value judgments are concerned with people, and the relevance to the actual situation at hand. So three co-guarantor attributes should be working together in order to work on that robust delivery, if you like. And what we, again, the other thing that we've developed here is interpreting that kind of robustness, those co-guarantor attributes, in terms of conversation, a model of bricolage. So we're conversing with the intervention, we're conversing amongst ourselves with different practitioners about that intervention, and we are conversing actually with the concepts that we are dealing with, which goes back to the Darwin little model that Kevin illustrated earlier. So those illustrate all three different elements of that conversation. And again, at different recursive levels, I think it's a really powerful way of trying to engage with that requisite literacy. So this is the model of requisite literacy that we developed for the evidence in STEP module, or the portfolio module. What we're saying here is that we have we nurture a requisite systems thinking literacy that engages continually with this notion of recovering systemic sensibilities, and that, if you like, is providing the systems thinking aptitudes that together develop the systems thinking in practice capabilities. And what I've been doing very recently, and I won't have time to discuss this a bit more here, but is supplementing that kind of activity model with a benchmark of 3 principles. 3 principles around applied systems thinking in practice. And essentially those 3 principles draw on 2 very generic principles. The first one is this methodical principle about the coupling of systemic and systematic. We sometimes lose sight of that interaction between the systemic and systematic and just focus on systemic. And I think we need to keep the coupling in mind there. The other thing is this operating principle. And this is the idea, again, it's been brought up in a number of occasions. Ray mentioned it in one sort of notion before. This notion of using systems, the language of systems, in 2 different ways. There's a there's an ontological device, the engineering, seeing systems out there, what I would call existential systems. And there's the epistemological notion of systems, which I think most people here are very much attuned with and engaged with. The important thing is to keep them together, to acknowledge that people experience things as systems out there. We shouldn't just be dismissing this. We have to somehow include it. And within each one of those principles that I've talked about, relational systems thinking in practice, perspective systems thinking in practice, and adaptive systems in thinking in practice, those 2 sub-principles, if you like, those 2 ideas of the operational principles of an existential system as well as an epistemological system are at play. And I think, again, we can actually convey that notion in any kind of professional area, in any situation of practice that we're dealing with. Thank you.